Imagine you are standing in a library. Not just any library. A royal archive, somewhere in London or Washington, D.C. You pull out a massive old map, printed in 1747. The paper is yellowed. The ink is faded. But the words are still there. Clear, deliberate, official.
It is a map of West Africa, drawn by the royal cartographer of King George II of England. And right there, along the coast, the very stretch of coastline where historians estimate that millions of African men, women, and children were kidnapped, chained, and loaded onto slave ships bound for the Americas, right there, on that coast, this royal British mapmaker wrote two words that will stop you cold. Kingdom of JUDA. Not Wida, not Uida, not Guinea. Judah, as in Judah, as in the ancient Hebrew tribe of Judah, as in one of the 12 tribes of Israel, written directly on a map of West Africa in 1747 by a man who worked for the King of England.
Now, before you scroll away, I need you to stay with me for just 60 more seconds. Because I know what you might be thinking. That is probably just a spelling mistake. Or a translation error. And that is exactly what I thought too. At first. But here is the thing. This man, Emanuel Bowen, was not making spelling mistakes. His maps were used to run an empire. His maps were used by merchants, by admirals, by politicians. His maps had to be accurate, or ships would sink, and fortunes would be lost. So the question is not, did he make a mistake? The real question is, what did Emanuel Bowen know in 1747 that we have somehow forgotten today? Stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you are going to look at the history of the slave trade in a completely different way. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it. Emanuel Bowen was born around 1694 in England, and he was not just any mapmaker. He held the official title of geographer to His Majesty King George II. Later in his career, he also became the official geographer to King Louis XV of France. Think about that for a moment. This man was the official cartographer to not one, but two of the most powerful monarchies in the 18th century world. His maps were not decorations. They were working documents. British merchants used them to plan trade routes. The Royal Navy used them to navigate coastlines. Politicians and colonial administrators used them to make decisions about which territories to claim, which ports to use, and yes, which populations to exploit. In 1747, Bowen published one of his most significant works. It was called A Complete Atlas, or Distinct View of the Known World. This atlas contained detailed maps of every continent, every known coastline, every major kingdom and territory that European powers had documented at that time. And on the map of West Africa, specifically on the section covering the area the Europeans called the Slave Coast, Emanuel Bowen wrote, Kingdom of JUDA. Now, I want you to really think about this. If you were the official cartographer to the King of England, and you were labeling a territory on a map that will be used for imperial commerce and navigation, you do not write down a name by accident. You write down the name that people in that region use to identify themselves. Or you write down the name that your sources, explorers, merchants, sea captains, missionaries, consistently reported back to London. So the question becomes, who told Emanuel Bowen to call this place Judah, and why? Drop a comment below. Do you think a royal cartographer of this level
would make a casual spelling error on an official imperial map? Tell me what you think. To understand the mystery on that map, we first need to understand the kingdom itself. The Kingdom of JUDA, also spelled Hueda or Fida, was a real, documented, historically verified West African kingdom. It existed along the coast of what is today the modern nation of Benin. At its height in the late 17th and early 18th century, the Kingdom of JUDA was one of the most active trading ports on the entire West African coast. European traders, French, Portuguese, English, Dutch, all competed fiercely to establish trading posts there. The kingdom had a sophisticated political system, a royal court, a standing army, and complex trade networks stretching deep into the interior of the continent. In 1727, the Kingdom of JUDA was conquered by the neighboring Kingdom of Dahomey, a powerful inland empire that then took control of the coastal slave trade. After that conquest, the name and the identity of the kingdom began to fade from the dominant historical record. But before that conquest, European documents, travel accounts, and maps consistently referred to this kingdom by a fascinating variety of names. The French called it Juda, the Portuguese called it Ajuda, the English called it Hueda. And on Emanuel Bowen's 1747 map, it is clearly labeled Kingdom of JUDA. Now here is where the linguistics get very interesting. Very interesting indeed. The local name for this kingdom, spoken by the people who actually lived there, was something close to Hueda or Hueda. Now say that out loud slowly. Hueda, Hueda, Hueda. Now say this word, Yehuda. That is the original Hebrew name for the tribe of Judah. Yehuda. Hueda, Yehuda. Now, I am not a linguist, and I am not going to tell you these two words are definitively connected. What I will tell you is this. Multiple scholars and researchers, including some working within mainstream African history, have noted the phonetic similarity between these names and have asked whether that similarity is coincidental. And here is what makes this question even more fascinating. It is not just the name. Because when European travelers and missionaries arrived in the Kingdom of JUDA in the late 1600s and early 1700s, they wrote detailed observations about the customs and practices of the people they found there. And some of those observations were unexpected. A French missionary writing in the early 1700s documented that the people of this coastal kingdom practiced male circumcision as a widespread cultural rite. Several European accounts noted that these communities observed dietary restrictions, specifically avoiding pork. There were documented ceremonial washing rituals and purification practices observed among certain groups in the region. Now, circumcision, dietary restrictions, purification rituals. If you know your Old Testament, your Torah, your Book of Leviticus, you recognize those practices. They are central to ancient Hebrew and Israelite religious law. So here is the question I want you to sit with. Is it possible that a population living on the West African coast in the 1700s was practicing cultural traditions that had ancient Semitic or Hebraic origins? And could that be why European mapmakers, who would have recognized those practices through their biblical education, consistently labeled this kingdom with a name that sounded remarkably like Judah? This is a genuine historical and anthropological question, and it deserves a genuine historical investigation. What do you think? Drop a comment. Is this a coincidence, or is there something deeper here? I read every single comment. Now let us go back to the Bowen map and look at it more carefully, because the name Kingdom of JUDA does not exist in isolation on this map. Around it, you can see other labels: Guinea, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, Negro Land. And this is where the geography becomes extremely revealing. Look at the term Negro Land.
On 18th century European maps, Negro land referred to the broad interior regions of West Africa, the vast territory south of the Sahara and north of the forest belt. But here is something that historians and map scholars have noted. On many of these early European maps, including Bowen's, there is a clear distinction made between Negro land to the interior and the coastal kingdoms with their own specific identities. The coastal zone, the area of the slave coast, was treated differently. It had named kingdoms. It had political entities with their own identities. And among all those coastal kingdoms labeled on the Bowen map, Iceni, Ardra, Benin, Calabar, there is exactly one that is labeled with a name carrying obvious biblical resonance: Kingdom of Judah. Not Kingdom of the Wida people, not Kingdom of JUDA, Judah. Now ask yourself, why would a trained, precise royal cartographer choose that specific rendering of the name when he had multiple phonetic options available to him? The Portuguese were calling it Ajuda. He could have used something similar. The local people called it something closer to Huida. He could have used that. Instead, Bowen, educated, informed, working for the British Crown, chose to write Judah. The same spelling used in many old European Bibles and religious texts to refer to the tribe and territory of Judah. That choice, made by a careful professional, is the detail that historians should be asking more questions about. Let us look at some of the historical accounts that were coming back to Europe from this region during the same period. In the early 1700s, a French ship's captain and trader named Jean Barbeau traveled extensively along the West African coast and wrote detailed accounts of what he observed. Barbeau described the Kingdom of JUDA as one of the most organized and commercially sophisticated kingdoms on the coast. He documented the royal court, the trade protocols, and the religious customs of the region. Other European visitors noted that the people of this coastal kingdom had priests, called Vodun priests in the Dahomean tradition, but that alongside local spiritual practices, there were also observable customs that European observers, trained in biblical scripture, found strikingly familiar. Now, it is important to be honest here. We need to be careful about interpreting these accounts too literally. European missionaries and traders in the 1700s often had agendas. They sometimes saw what they wanted to see, or misunderstood local customs through the lens of their own cultural background. So we cannot simply take every European observation and build an unchecked theory on top of it. But here is what we can say with confidence. Multiple independent European sources from different nations, French, English, Portuguese, over a period of several decades, consistently used the name Judah or Judah to identify this specific kingdom. That is not one person making a mistake. That is a pattern. And patterns in historical documentation deserve serious academic attention. Pause the video right now and ask yourself, when was the last time your history class taught you anything about the Kingdom of JUDA? And why do you think that is? Here is where the story takes a turn that is difficult to explain away. If you look at maps of West Africa from the 1600s and early 1700s, from multiple European nations, you will find the name Judah or Judah appearing consistently for this coastal kingdom. French maps, Portuguese charts, British imperial maps like Bowen's, all of them use some version of that name. But then, as you move into the late 1700s and especially into the 1800s, something changes. The name begins to disappear. By the mid-1800s, most maps and colonial documents refer to this location simply as Huida, a phonetic rendering that sounds similar to the local pronunciation, but has completely lost the biblical resonance of Judah. The kingdom itself, of course, had been conquered by Dahomey in 1727, so its political identity had already been erased. But the name on the maps, that took longer to change. And here is the historical context that surrounds that change. The 19th century was the era of what historians call scientific racism, the attempt to use emerging scientific theories to justify racial hierarchy and colonial domination. It was the era when influential thinkers began arguing that African peoples had no meaningful history, no great civilizations, no complex religions or cultural systems of their own. These arguments were used to justify the continued exploitation of African people and their lands. Now, think about what it would mean for those arguments. If it became widely known that the people being enslaved and transported across the Atlantic were, by many historical accounts, a population with ancient Semitic cultural traditions, a people whose kingdom had been labeled Judah on royal maps for over a century, a people whose customs bore documented similarities to the laws recorded in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. If that story became the dominant narrative, the entire ideological justification for the slave trade and colonialism would have been in serious trouble. Because you cannot simultaneously claim that a people have no history, no religion, and no civilization, while also acknowledging that European cartographers were calling their kingdom Judah well into the 18th century. I am not telling you what to conclude from this. I am telling you that the historical timeline, the appearance and then the disappearance of the name Judah on Western maps, aligns very uncomfortably with the rise of ideologies that required African history to be erased. That alignment is worth discussing. It is worth researching, and it is worth asking about. Comment below. Do you think this name change was purely linguistic and accidental? Or does the timing tell a different story? Let me know what you think. Now, let me be clear about something important. This is not a settled question in mainstream academic history. Most historians who specialize in West African history and the Atlantic slave trade will tell you that the name Whydah and its variants, including Judah and Ajudah, are simply different European phonetic interpretations of the local Whydah people's name for themselves. That is the mainstream academic position, and it is a reasonable position. Languages get transliterated differently by speakers of different languages. A French speaker and an English speaker hearing the same African name will often write it down very differently. So the name Judah may simply be how French and Portuguese traders heard and wrote down Whydah. That is one explanation. But here is what that explanation does not fully address. Even if the phonetic similarity between Whydah and Yehuda is coincidental, the documented cultural practices are still there in the historical record. The circumcision practices, the dietary patterns, the purification rituals, these are documented by multiple independent European sources. And there is a growing body of serious academic research, including work by scholars at African universities, exploring the possibility that some West African populations had ancient cultural connections to Semitic and Middle Eastern traditions, transmitted through centuries of trans-Saharan trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The idea that ancient Hebraic or Israelite influences could have reached sub-Saharan Africa through those ancient trade networks is not a fringe theory. There are peer-reviewed academic papers discussing exactly this possibility. The Beta Israel community of Ethiopia, the ancient Jewish community there, proves beyond any doubt that Israelite cultural and religious traditions did reach deep into sub-Saharan Africa in ancient times. So the question of whether similar influences might have reached West Africa is a legitimate one. It simply has not received the mainstream academic attention it deserves. And that, arguably, is a story in itself. I want to hear from you right now. Do you think mainstream history has done a good job of investigating the cultural origins and identities of enslaved African populations? Comment your honest answer below. The transatlantic slave trade did not just take people from their land. It took their names. It took their languages. It took their family structures. It took their cultural practices. And in many cases, it took their historical identity entirely. When an enslaved person arrived in the Americas, they were typically given a new name, a European name. They were forbidden to speak their original language. They were prevented from practicing their cultural traditions. The goal was not just labor. The goal was the erasure of identity. And if the people who arrived on those ships carried with them, in their cultural memory, in their practices, in their ceremonies, traditions that connected them to an ancient Semitic heritage, that erasure would have been especially powerful. Because you cannot claim your ancient identity if you do not even know you had one. The map of Emanuel Bowen, sitting quietly in historical archives, printed in 1747, is one small window back through that erasure. It is evidence, not of a conspiracy theory, but of a historical record that has been incompletely explored. And in the age of genetic genealogy, linguistic archaeology, and digital access to historical archives, we now have tools to investigate these questions more deeply than ever before. Organizations like the Slave Voyages Project, housed at major American universities, have spent decades digitizing records of the transatlantic slave trade, tracking which ships left which ports, carrying people from which regions. Their data confirms that a significant number of enslaved people transported to the Americas, particularly to Haiti, Brazil, and the Caribbean, came from precisely the coastal region around the former Kingdom of JUDA. The people of the Kingdom of JUDA did not disappear. They were scattered. And their descendants are alive today in Haiti, in Brazil, in the Caribbean, in the United States. Many of them are still searching for the history that was taken from them. So let us bring this all together. In 1747, Emanuel Bowen, the official royal cartographer to King George II of England, published a map of West Africa. On that map, he labeled a specific coastal kingdom, Kingdom of JUDA. That kingdom was located in the area of modern-day Benin. European accounts from the same period documented cultural practices among the people of that region that bore documented similarities to ancient Hebraic traditions. The name Judah appeared consistently on French, Portuguese, and British maps for over a century. And then, in the 19th century, as colonial ideologies demanded that African peoples be portrayed as having no history and no identity, that name quietly disappeared from Western maps. Now, I am not asking you to accept any single interpretation of what all this means. I am asking you to do something simpler than that. I am asking you to look. Look at the Bowen map. It is real. You can find it in historical archives and digital libraries right now. Look at the historical accounts of the Kingdom of JUDA. They are real, written by real European travelers in the 1700s. Look at the data from the Slave Voyages Project. Real, academic, documented. And then ask yourself the question that historians should have been asking loudly for decades. Who were the people of the Kingdom of JUDA? Where did their cultural traditions come from? And what happened to those traditions when those people were scattered across the Atlantic world? The map is still there. The ink is still clear. And the question has never been more urgent. Look at that map one more time. If you could look into the faces of the people who once lived in the Kingdom of JUDA, the men, women, and children who built that civilization along the West African coast, what do you think you would see? What do you think history has been keeping from you?
Comment the truth below if you believe that the history of enslaved Africans deserves deeper, more honest investigation. And if you found this video meaningful, share it with someone who needs to see it.
Because this story does not belong locked away in an archive. It belongs to everyone. Subscribe if you want to go deeper, because we are just getting started. There is so much more of this story to uncover, and we are going to uncover it together.